2 weeks after they went missing, the first boys have been rescued from a cave in Thailand. It was an operation that involved many divers and experts from around the world. This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Rising waters, falling oxygen levels and no easy way out. It's a treacherous situation for anyone, especially 12 children and their football coach who've been trapped in a cave in Thailand. It's a story that has gripped the attention of much of the world. And on Sunday, several of the trapped boys were successfully rescued and taken to a nearby hospital for treatment. Elite divers guided the boys through hours of walking, crawling and swimming with an oxygen tank out of a deep cave complex. The teammates, along with their coach, had been trapped for more than 2 weeks. The rest of the team is still making its way out, but monsoon rains are threatening the dangerous mission. Charlotte Bellis takes a look now at some of the challenges of this operation.
The Tom Luang Cave is in northern Thailand in the Chiang Rai province near the border with Myanmar and Laos. It is one of the longest caves in the country, stretching 10 kilometres through the Doi Nang Nong mountain range. The boys are stuck just past a cavern known as Pattaya Beach. Now, looking inside the mountain, 1.5 kilometres from the main entrance, Navy SEAL teams have set up a base in a cavern known as Chamber 3. 3 kilometres in is Samyang Junction. It forks off to an exit, but that's flooded. The cave widens to large caverns and narrows to passages so small that rescuers need to crawl to get through. The passageway climbs and drops, which means when it rains, water builds up in these dips. 4 kilometres in is Pattaya Beach. The boys are about 400 metres after the spot and 800 to 1,000 metres below the surface. To get the boys out through the flooded patches, rescuers have attached a guideline and dotted emergency oxygen tanks every 25 to 50 metres. The plan is that as they swim, one Navy diver will be beside them, another one behind. Keep in mind, some boys don't know how to swim, there are strong currents, and the water is dark and muddy. They're being given wetsuits, boots, helmets, and a scuba mask, but no tank. The proposal being they'll get oxygen from their dive buddy supply. Now, it'll take at least 5 hours to get each boy out, so in all, it may take a couple of days to complete the rescue.
Well, an extraordinary rescue. Let's now join our guests to talk about it. Joining us from Gosport in the UK, Mike Tipton, Professor of Human and Applied Physiology at the Extreme Environments Laboratory at the University of Portsmouth. He joins us via Skype. In London, Andrea, Danese, child psychiatrist at King's College London and consultant at Maudsley Hospital. And from Auckland, also via Skype, Neil Bennett. He's a diver and managing director at New Zealand Diving. Well, we'll get to you all in just a moment. But first, let's talk to Bill Whitehouse. He's a spokesman for the British Cave Rescue Council and has been in direct contact with the British divers helping with the rescue in Thailand. He joins us on the line now from Buxton in the UK. So, Bill, I mean, what a relief to hear that these first boys have been coming out and ahead of schedule as well. What are you hearing about the rescue effort?
Yes, it's an incredible good news. The operation to bring them out is extremely dangerous and frankly very risky. But there's been a lot of planning going on in the last few days in preparation for if the Thai authorities gave the go-ahead to try a dive rescue, to the way to do it. Well, whatever way they have done it, they seem to have got it right. Because however many have come out now, if the processes they use have worked for them, then God willing, there's a chance that it'll work for the others as well. So it's excellent news.
Absolutely. As we are recording this programme on Sunday night Doha time, it is 6 boys, we believe, that have been brought out.
Really?
You're in touch, Bill, aren't you, with the British divers who were involved in this operation, the 2 men who first of all found the boys. What role are they playing in this part of the operation?
In this part of the operation, well, we can't be sure, of course, because once things started, of course, they're incommunicado, they're probably underground. Now, Rick Stanton and Rob Valanthan, who were the two divers who first got through to the boys a while ago now, isn't it? They're still on site. Whilst I don't know for certain that they were involved in today's dive, I would be astonished if they weren't. I mean, there are now on site 7 British cave divers, and there are some from other nationalities, and there are the Navy, the Thai Navy SEAL divers, who are not cave divers; they're the open water divers. Who have been operating for an open water diver in a very unusual, environment for them, and what they've been doing, is truly heroic, and it's very sad that one of them lost their life during the process the other day.
Indeed. Okay.
I mean, cave diving is a very serious and different type of diving to open water diving. There are all sorts of considerations that come in about the way equipment is used, the different kinds of risks and things which have had to be built into any rescue operation. And bear in mind that these children not only aren't, they're certainly not cave divers, but they're not divers and not even swimmers, I gather.
OK, Bill Whitehouse, we appreciate you taking the time there to join us at the top of our programme here on Inside Story. Thanks very much. Let's go straight now to Dr. Andrea there in London. 6 boys out at this stage. Of course, this programme will be airing and hopefully we'll be hearing of more boys coming out by the time we do go to air. I mean, what an enormous sense of relief for them, for their families and indeed for the rescuers.
This is fantastic news indeed.
Just talk us through what kind of those emotions are as you're being rescued.
Yeah. I would expect that most of the children will be probably elated by the rescue after the long ordeal that have been subjected over the past few days. Many of them will probably become quite emotional. I would expect actually most of them to experience some emotional symptoms over the next few days. This may become evident as them being particularly irritable or becoming tearful. Of course, they will be very happy, but they will have very strong, intense emotion to cope with.
And they'll be closely watched, won't they, Mike? We know that they are being flown straight to hospital by helicopter, one of the top hospitals in Chiang Rai region. Physically, how are they likely to be?
Well, I understand, although again everything seems unconfirmed, that the first boys to come out were the ones that were regarded as the weakest. So I suspect, if people are able to distinguish how well the different boys are, that the ones that are the weakest are probably the ones that are suffering most from dehydration, malnutrition, and perhaps even from hypothermia or getting cold. So there's nothing that should have happened to them physically that can't be corrected, after the event. I think probably the longer term consequences will be psychological rather than medical or physiological.
OK. Neil, that bodes well, doesn't it? If the weakest were being brought out first and they have come out as quickly as they have, it bodes well for the rest of the rescue operation.
I mean, absolutely. They're going to try to, obviously, as conditions deteriorate, they're going to try and use the stronger ones to deal with the more complicated situations. So getting the weaker ones out first allows them to, first of all, try to assist them out and also to get them out in the easiest conditions. So that bodes well for the rest of the teams that now have to be rescued.
Now, of course, diving was always the big concern here as part of this rescue operation. What were the risks to the children who were having to dive and indeed the divers who were leading them?
Well, there's immense risks involved. The pumping of the water has actually reduced that quite considerably. Allowing them to walk out large sections has really helped the situation. But you've got to think of some of the depths they have in some of those cave parks. I understand that some of the depths were down to 30 metres in large sections with a 400-metre swim. That bodes itself to possible chest injuries, that sort of thing, with breathing, respiration problems. And then you have the narrow tube sections, which in itself is probably the most extreme part of it. Because they can't wear full school gear through there, they're having to have no tanks being basically pushed or dragged through. And there's also, I understand, a U-bend in there with various obstructions. So it's an extreme environment to be in zero visibility and extreme cold. So these guys are actually facing probably the biggest challenge of their lives, trying to go through that without being able to swim.
Absolutely. I mean, from my limited experience of diving, trying to remember to breathe normally is very difficult when you're underwater. I understand that these boys are being fitted with a full face mask, which is easier than a mouthpiece.
Yeah, but the concern is that I would imagine that if the child panics and tries to bolt to the surface, which doesn't exist because they're in an overhead environment, one of the things people do when they panic is actually spit out the mask. So having a full face mask helps reduce that problem. And being that they're going to be in a line, so you have one rescuer in front, the child in the middle, then a rescuer behind, the opportunity to actually get that regulator back into their mouth is quite limited. So reducing that possibility is a big help with a full face mask.
Andrea, how is it best to try and keep these boys calm?
Well, I think, first of all, it's really important to find ways and words to explain facts very easily to them. So think about the kind of communication the rescuer might have with their own children and families. To find ways in which communication is clear and therefore children know exactly what is going to happen, what are the things that they can do if anything should go wrong, so that they would know at least the facts. Secondly, it's really important, I think, for the rescuer to build some rapport with the children, spend some time with them, which I understand has happened over the past few days, so that the children can learn about them and effectively find ways to trust them should they need to in emergency situations.
You talk about the facts there. I mean, one wonders how honest you have to be with children when you're asking them to take risks. I mean, presumably there is no way that they would have mentioned the fact that the former Navy SEAL died on Friday and he was exiting the cave.
I would assume they wouldn't have. What I was referring to is the instruction on what to do when, as the rescue operation were ongoing. So it's really important that they knew what was happening to them, because having unpredictable things happening to them, of course, would only increase the risk of them becoming distressed as the rescue actually occurs.
Do you think age might be on their side here? Do you think as adults we tend to panic more and look at the worst case scenarios, whereas a young boy might perhaps see it as something might be more intrepid, might see it more as an adventure?
Perhaps. Perhaps. It's really difficult to say. What we do know is that actually in adolescent, it's actually more difficult to cope with these intense emotions. So what you may be referring to is the idea that they may take this as a challenge in some ways or another, and therefore be motivated to do their best rather than being anxious and restrict their actions throughout the rescue operations. But if anything, I would expect adolescents to struggle coping with these more intense emotions.
Right. Mike, the physiological impacts, I mean, this is a 1 to 2 kilometre journey. It took 5 hours for experienced cavers to complete. It's diving, crawling, hiking. I mean, it's incredibly taxing, physiologically speaking. How are these children going to build up the strength, or how did they build up the strength, having been malnourished for 9 days?
Yes, I mean, it's quite remarkable. It's not the kind of thing you'd want to take on if you were, fully fit and healthy. So they obviously maintained their physiological status pretty well over those first 9 days. And the very fact that they survived 9 days tells us that, some of the major stressors like dehydration and low oxygen levels weren't really present and affecting them. So there's that aspect to it. I mean, I think the other important point to make is, although we've said that the weakest have come out first, as assessed by a doctor, that doesn't necessarily mean the weakest in terms of their ability to undertake this task.
Right.
Because those initial decisions will have been based on a health basis rather than a physical fitness or ability to dive. So, you know, we're halfway there, but we're certainly, you know, we've certainly got some way to go. And my concern would be things like not being able to meet the physical challenge. You know, a wetsuit is fine, but if it's a poorly fitting wetsuit, it's next to useless. And as we've already heard, the way people react to having to go and breathe underwater that have had no experience of doing that is somewhat unpredictable. We've taken lots of naive people and taught them to use emergency breathing systems for helicopter underwater escapes, and the reactions you get are quite unpredictable. Some people just find it almost physically impossible to take a breath in when their head is under the water. Now, hopefully, none of those will apply in this case, and we'll see a successful completion. But we're certainly not out of the woods yet.
Neil, the rescue team spent 3-4 days training for this, and then they trained the boys. Do you think they would have taken the boys on sort of practice dives in the water to get them used to breathing underwater?
Absolutely. I mean, the first few days will all be about building up a rapport with the rescuers, getting the confidence that the person is going to take them underwater, that they can rely on. So they'll be getting used to them breathing through, the sensation of breathing through a regulator underwater. A lot of people, as colleague rightly said, when they get water around the face, it automatically induces panic. So water around the mask or flooding the mask creates panic. So they'll be practicing those sort of skills and what they can expect. Because struggling through the cave system, they're going to have this problem where water is going to enter the mask or it is going to enter their mouth. And they're basically telling them to either swallow or spit out the water. Don't worry about it, but to continue, keep the regulator in. So all those sort of things they're going to experience as they're struggling to get through the cave, they have to be familiar with. And the other thing as well, people are kind of overlooking that the flow of water through that cave is going to be immense. So not only have they got to deal with the water conditions, they've got to be able to deal with the currents they'll be fighting against. So it will be physically demanding for them. But they have to build that rapport with the rescuers, which they have been doing. And by the sounds of the rescue so far, it's going pretty well.
Mike, what sort of state is the body in after being 2 weeks underground?
That is almost completely dependent on the amount of fluid you've received, the amount of food you've received, and the amount of exercise you've been able to undertake. I mean, at one extreme, you wouldn't survive that long. You know, your estimated survival time without any fluid is just a few days. At the other extreme, provided that you've got fresh water and food and you've been able to exercise, you should be able to remain reasonably capable. But you would expect to see a pretty significant reduction in their maximum physical capability, and they may well need to come close to that to make an escape. The other big thing we see, which is we don't really understand, it's a sort of psychophysiological phenomena, is the way people react to being rescued. There are a significant number of people who actually fight and fight and fight for their survival and do really well, and just at the point of being rescued, their condition deteriorates. And they're the ones that need to be looked after particularly carefully, in this case, towards the end of the rescue and on, reaching the surface. So, as I say, it's very, very variable. It's very between individuals as well. But,
Okay.
it's going to be a significant challenge.
Andrea, that's a fascinating phenomenon, isn't it? That you're fighting so much to survive, and just at the point when you reach it, you give up. Why might that be?
Yeah. So what we know about these kind of situations is that when we are exposed to stress, be it acute or chronic, there is an elevation in stress hormones, such as cortisol. What happens quite often is that after acute stresses, when we effectively start relaxing, that cortisol also goes down, and what we see is that the amount of energy and activity that has sustained people throughout the stressful experience will then translate in a lot of weakness and tiredness, and in some ways even cognitive impairment after that experience. So I entirely agree that we need to really have a holistic understanding of what these children will go through, thinking about their physical threats and limitations, including, of course, darkness, but also food and infections, as we have discussed. And this will partly have an effect on how they will respond after the rescue operation will be hopefully successfully over.
Yeah, let's hope that the rescue operation continues as it's begun. But Neil, let's just visit briefly the scenario where it is aborted. Under what conditions might that be the case?
Well, one of the main ones would be an unfortunate fatality or some sort of blockage in the tube system, the narrow tube. In that scenario, then they're going to have to turn people back. Any sort of cave collapsing, or if the water rate, which is one of the main factors why they pushed it forward, if the water levels start increasing, the flow rate in the cave will naturally increase. And that may well force them to go back because they might not be able to cope with that flow rate. One of the other things that we probably didn't touch on is actually the reason why they pushed it forward was the amount of oxygen that's reducing in the cave system itself. And that itself can bring on respiratory problems. Right. So any sort of fluid build-up in the lungs, that's really going to affect the divers moving forward. So that should be something we really consider, is respiratory problems due to poor oxygen and air conditions.
Yeah, Mike, how low did those oxygen levels get?
The report I heard was about 15%, so that's down from a normal 21%. That's still okay because, I mean, you can translate those percentages into altitudes. So that's a bit like going to, just around about 2,000 meters. So that's not so much of a problem. But, once it got down to 13 or 12%, then you're starting to see some of the symptoms of hypoxia. So I think probably as we've just heard, this particular option was the sort of least worst option. So if we get to the situation where we have to, retain some of the boys in the cave, then clearly there's going to have to be some fairly significant interventions there. The other problem that kind of gets missed is not just the reduction in oxygen, but if you're in a situation where you're not getting fresh air into that situation, you're also going to get a build-up of carbon dioxide, and that in itself can be, potentially very hazardous. So if those numbers were right and we were down to about 15%, then it was getting pretty close to the time to go.
Andrea, just lastly, even if when the boys are all out, the ordeal's not over, is it? What are the sort of long-term mental health impacts one must be watching for in this team, and not forgetting in the coach as well?
Absolutely. So I would expect, first of all, that all the children will be screened for a considerable amount of time for their psychological consequences after this ordeal. And I would expect that the screening will detect that about 10 to 20% of them will develop enduring mental health problems, so psychiatric disorders. The kind of psychiatric disorders that can be developed after these kind of traumatic experiences is quite broad, includes conditions such as depression, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders, but also other type of conditions which we call externalizing, so acting out in some ways or another. And these are conditions that we call conduct problems, but also substance abuse. It's important that the assessment is thorough and broad to detect the different types of psychiatric problems that these children might develop. And at the same time, it's important that the children are also assessed for the risk.
Okay.
We know that all the conditions that I just mentioned are associated with increased risk of self-harm, for example. So it's really important that the risk is assessed.
Okay, sorry, Andrea, we do have to leave it there. Good news that the rescue operation has so far been successful. Let's hope that all 12 boys and their coach do indeed emerge healthy and happy. Many thanks today for you all for joining us. Mike Tipton, Andrea Danese and Neil Bennett. Also Bill Whitehouse at the top of the show. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.